He smiled at me in court. Like he'd already won. He had no idea I exhumed his first wife. When my husband's dead wife's exhumation results came back positive for the same rare poison appearing in my blood work, I realized I was supposed to be victim number 2. The courtroom felt like it was spinning as I sat there holding the toxicology report, my hands steadier than they'd been in months, watching Preston Whitfield, the man I'd pledged my life to, smile at me like he'd already won. He had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that the weakness he'd been causing in my body had led me to run tests that would destroy him. He thought I was dying. He thought I was too sick to fight. He was wrong. If you've ever trusted someone completely, given them access to every part of your life, let them make you coffee every morning and bring you vitamins every night, you need to hear this story. Because the person poisoning you might be the one saying they love you. The fluorescent courthouse lights made everything look harsh and clinical, which felt appropriate given how I'd spent the last 4 months of my life. In hospitals, running tests, searching for answers to why my body was failing me. I'm a cardiac surgeon. I've held human hearts in my hands and brought people back from the edge of death. But I couldn't figure out why I was dying until it was almost too late. The irony wasn't lost on me. Preston sat at the defendant's table in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the same one he'd worn to our wedding 3 years ago. His salt and pepper hair was styled exactly the way I used to love, distinguished and trustworthy. He looked like someone's beloved father, someone's dependable husband, someone who brought flowers home on Fridays and remembered anniversaries. He looked nothing like a murderer. But I could smell the courthouse, old wood and floor polish and fear, and I could feel my heart beating strong and steady in my chest for the first time in months. Because I wasn't dying anymore. Because I'd figured it out. Because the poison that was supposed to kill me quietly in my sleep had instead led me to the truth about everything. My lawyer, Patricia Chen, sat beside me reviewing her notes one last time. Across the aisle, Preston's attorney, a slick corporate type named Richard Vance, was leaning in close to whisper something to his client. Preston nodded, then turned to look directly at me. He mouthed the words, "I love you," with such convincing sincerity that for a split second, I almost forgot he'd been systematically poisoning me with thallium for 7 months. Almost. Judge Margaret Rosewood entered, and we all stood. She was a legend in Seattle's legal community, known for her sharp mind and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. Her gray eyes swept across the room as she settled into her seat, and I felt a small spark of hope. This woman would see through Preston's performance. She had to. The prosecutor, Daniel Martinez, had warned me this morning that Preston would try to paint me as unstable, as a workaholic doctor who'd neglected her marriage and was now lashing out with false accusations. He'd said Preston's team would argue that my symptoms were from stress, from exhaustion, from anything except intentional poisoning. They'd claim the exhumation of Catherine Whitfield, Preston's first wife, was a desperate attempt to justify my paranoia. But I had the toxicology reports. I had Catherine's autopsy results. I had Dr. Sarah Chen's expert analysis showing the same rare isotope signature in both samples. And I had something Preston didn't know about, his search history from the laptop he thought he'd wiped clean, showing months of research into undetectable poisons, inheritance laws, and life insurance policies. I looked around the courtroom and saw familiar faces scattered throughout the gallery. My colleague, Dr. James Morrison, was there, the one who'd first noticed my tremors during surgery and insisted I get tested. My best friend Rachel sat in the 3rd row, her face tight with anger at what Preston had done. And in the back, almost hidden, was a woman I'd met only 2 months ago. Margaret Whitfield, Preston's first wife's sister, who'd been trying to prove Catherine was murdered for 5 years. Preston caught me looking at Margaret, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That was the only crack in his perfect facade. He'd thought Catherine's family had given up. He'd thought her death was buried along with her body. He'd thought he was untouchable. The weight of the envelope in my lap felt significant, heavy with the truth that would unravel everything. Inside were lab results that Preston's lawyer hadn't seen yet, evidence that would be introduced at exactly the right moment. Not yet, though. First, I needed to let Preston feel confident. Let him think his charm and his carefully constructed story of the grieving widower who'd found love again would be enough. Let him believe that my reputation as an overworked surgeon would make people doubt my accusations. My hands weren't shaking anymore. That was the first thing I'd noticed when I stopped drinking the coffee Preston made every morning. The tremors had disappeared within days of switching to hospital cafeteria coffee. Then my vision cleared. Then the nausea stopped. Then I'd gotten angry enough to start really digging. Judge Rosewood's voice cut through my thoughts. We're here today for the preliminary hearing in the state of Washington versus Preston James Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, you're charged with attempted murder in the first degree, as well as suspicion of murder in the death of Catherine Ann Whitfield. How do you plead? Preston stood, his voice steady and sad. Not guilty, Your Honor. These accusations are devastating and completely false. I loved my first wife, and I love my current wife. This is a terrible misunderstanding. I watched him perform his innocence, and I thought about the morphine vial I'd found hidden in his office safe. I thought about Catherine's medical records that showed the same symptoms I'd experienced. I thought about the life insurance policy he'd taken out on me 6 months ago, doubling the coverage without mentioning it. Judge Rosewood nodded. We'll begin with opening statements. Mr. Martinez, you may proceed. This was it. The moment where everything I'd discovered would finally be said out loud in a room full of witnesses. The moment Preston would realize that his perfect plan had one fatal flaw. He'd married a doctor who knew how to read her own dying body's signs. 3 years earlier, I never imagined I'd end up fighting for my life against someone I'd trusted completely. Back then, I was at the peak of my career. Seattle Grace Medical Center had just promoted me to head of cardiothoracic surgery, making me the youngest person to ever hold that position. At 34, I was performing 37 surgeries a month, publishing research papers, and mentoring residents who looked at me like I had all the answers. I barely had time to sleep, let alone date. The hospital fundraiser gala was supposed to be a networking obligation, nothing more. My colleague, Dr. Morrison, practically dragged me there, insisting I needed to show my face and schmooze with the donors who kept our research programs funded. I remember standing near the champagne fountain in a black dress I'd bought specifically for these events, checking my phone every few minutes for updates on a patient in ICU. That's when Preston approached me. He wasn't like the other men at these galas, the ones who either hit on me aggressively or treated me like I was too intimidating to talk to. He simply stood beside me at the bar and said, "You look like someone counting the minutes until you can leave." His voice was warm, understanding, with just enough humor to make me smile despite my exhaustion. I turned to look at him properly. He was handsome in an understated way, maybe 45, with kind eyes and smile lines that suggested he laughed often. His navy suit was expensive but not showy, and he held his whiskey glass like someone comfortable in his own skin. "Is it that obvious?" I asked. "Only to someone who feels exactly the same way," he replied. "Preston Whitfield. I'm supposedly here to donate money to your hospital, but honestly, I'd rather be home reading a good book." Something about his honesty disarmed me. Dr. Sloan Mercer, and I'd rather be in surgery, which probably makes me sound like a workaholic. Preston laughed, a genuine sound that made something warm bloom in my chest. "Not at all. It makes you sound passionate about saving lives. That's admirable, not obsessive." We talked for 2 hours that night. He told me about his work in commercial real estate development, how he'd built his company from nothing over 20 years. He spoke about his late wife Catherine with such tender sadness that my heart ached for him. She died of a sudden heart condition 2 years earlier, he said, and he was only just starting to feel like himself again. "I wasn't looking to meet anyone," he admitted as the gala was ending. "But talking to you tonight felt like the first real conversation I've had in months. Could I take you to dinner sometime? I said yes without hesitation. Something about Preston felt safe, steady, like someone who understood that my career wasn't a phase but a calling. Our first date was at a quiet Italian restaurant in Capitol Hill, the kind of place with low lighting and wine bottles lining the walls. Preston asked thoughtful questions about my work, listening intently as I explained the intricacies of valve replacement surgery. He didn't glaze over or check his phone. He was genuinely interested. My late wife was a teacher, he said over tiramisu. She used to say that watching someone talk about their passion was like watching art happen in real time. That's how I feel listening to you describe your surgeries. I felt myself falling for him with every word. Here was a man who'd loved deeply and lost tragically, who understood grief and dedication, who didn't need me to be anything other than exactly who I was. When he drove me home that night, he kissed me softly at my doorstep and said, "I'd like to see you again, if you're willing to fit a boring real estate developer into your extraordinary life." The courtship was perfect. Preston sent flowers to the hospital with notes that made the nurses sigh romantically. He showed up at the end of my 36-hour shifts with takeout containers of soup and insisted I eat before driving home. He met me at the gym at 6 a.m. because those were the only hours I could exercise. He never complained about canceled dates when emergencies called me back to the hospital. "Your patients need you," he'd say simply. "I can wait." 8 months later, he proposed at the Japanese garden in the Washington Park Arboretum. It was spring, and the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. He'd arranged everything perfectly, even hiring a photographer to capture the moment. "Sloan, you've brought light back into my life when I thought I'd never feel joy again," he said, kneeling on the stone path. "I want to spend whatever years I have left making you as happy as you've made me." I said yes through tears. The ring was a vintage sapphire surrounded by diamonds, elegant and unique. "It belonged to my grandmother," Preston explained. "Catherine wore my mother's ring, but I wanted you to have something that was just yours, something special." That detail touched me deeply. He was being thoughtful about honoring his past while building our future. The wedding was intimate, just 50 people at a boutique hotel overlooking Puget Sound. Preston handled most of the planning because I was in the middle of a groundbreaking clinical trial. He seemed to anticipate my every preference, from the white peonies I loved to the string quartet playing Vivaldi. My parents adored him. My colleagues approved. Even Dr. Morrison, who was notoriously skeptical of everyone, pulled me aside during the reception and said, "You found a good one, Sloan. Hold on to him." Our honeymoon in Tuscany was dreamlike. Preston photographed me in every piazza, learned Italian phrases to make me laugh, and never once seemed bothered when I had to take calls about patient emergencies. "This is who you are," he'd say, kissing my forehead. I married a surgeon, not a trophy wife. But looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. The way he always offered to make my coffee in the morning, insisting it was his way of caring for me. How he'd bring me vitamins every night, saying he worried I wasn't taking care of myself. The casual questions about my life insurance policy and whether the hospital provided good coverage. The time I caught him going through my medical files at home, and he'd laughed it off saying he was just curious about my research. I told myself he was attentive. I told myself he cared. I told myself I was lucky to have found someone so devoted after Catherine's tragic death. I never once questioned whether her death had been quite as natural as he claimed. The tremors started 6 months after our wedding. I was in the middle of a mitral valve repair when my hands began shaking so badly that Dr. Morrison had to take over. I'd never lost control in surgery before, not once in 12 years of practicing medicine. I stood there at Seattle Grace's operating table, staring at my trembling fingers like they belonged to someone else, while my patient's life hung in the balance. Morrison completed the procedure flawlessly, but afterwards he cornered me in the scrub room with concern etched across his face. "Sloan, that's the 3rd time this month I've seen you struggle with fine motor control," he said quietly. You need to see someone. Today. I wanted to argue, to insist it was just stress or lack of sleep, but I couldn't deny what was happening to my body. My hands shook when I held my coffee cup. My vision blurred randomly throughout the day. Some mornings I woke up so nauseous I could barely stand. I'd attributed it all to the grueling schedule I maintained, the 60-hour weeks that had been my normal for over a decade. But Morrison was right. Something was wrong. I made an appointment with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, one of our hospital's top neurologists. She ran me through a battery of tests over the next 2 weeks. MRI scans of my brain came back clean. Blood work showed slightly elevated liver enzymes, but nothing alarming. Nerve conduction studies were normal. I'm not seeing any obvious neurological pathology, Elena said, her brow furrowed as she reviewed my results. But your symptoms are real, and they're progressing. I want to run a more comprehensive toxicology panel. Toxicology? I asked, confused. You think I've been exposed to something? Elena hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Your symptom cluster, tremors, nausea, vision problems, fatigue. They're consistent with several things. Autoimmune conditions, yes, but also certain types of poisoning. It's probably nothing, but I'd rather rule it out completely. I agreed to the tests, still not understanding what she was really suggesting. That night, Preston made dinner like he always did, his special pasta carbonara that I loved. He brought it to me in bed because I'd been too tired to come downstairs. You're working too hard, darling, he said, stroking my hair as I ate. Maybe it's time to cut back your schedule. Your health is more important than any surgery. The concern in his voice sounded so genuine, so loving. I leaned into his touch and thought about how lucky I was to have someone who cared so much. 2 weeks later, Elena called me at 7 a.m. Her voice was tight, controlled, the way doctors sound when they're delivering news they wish they didn't have to share. Sloan, I need you to come to my office immediately. Don't eat or drink anything before you get here. Nothing at all. Do you understand? Something in her tone made my blood run cold. Elena, what did you find? There was a long pause. Thallium. Your blood work shows thallium poisoning. Sloan, this doesn't happen accidentally. Someone is doing this to you. The phone nearly slipped from my shaking hands. Thallium. I knew what that meant. I'd studied it in medical school, seen case studies of murders committed with this particular poison. It was called the poisoner's poison because the symptoms mimicked natural illness. It was tasteless, odorless, and if administered in small doses over time, almost impossible to detect until it was too late. How long? I whispered. Based on your levels and symptom progression, I'd estimate you've been exposed for approximately 7 months. Sloan, at the rate the poison is accumulating in your system, you have maybe 6 weeks before the damage becomes irreversible. We need to start chelation therapy immediately, and we need to contact the police. I sat on the edge of my bed in the home I shared with Preston, my mind racing through every possibility. Accidental exposure? Impossible. Thallium wasn't something you encountered by chance. Someone had to obtain it deliberately, had to be administering it consistently, had to be waiting for me to die. My eyes fell on the coffee cup on my nightstand, the one Preston had brought me 30 minutes earlier. The coffee he made for me every single morning without fail, always insisting it was his way of taking care of me. My stomach twisted with a realization so horrible I almost couldn't process it. I thought about Catherine, Preston's first wife, the sudden heart condition that killed her, the way Preston described her final months, the fatigue, the weakness, the doctors who couldn't figure out what was wrong until it was too late. Oh God. Oh God. He'd done this before. I grabbed my laptop with trembling hands and searched for Catherine's obituary. Catherine Ann Whitfield, beloved teacher, died suddenly at age 38 from complications of cardiomyopathy. Survived by her loving husband, Preston. I'd never questioned it before. Why would I? People died of heart conditions. I was a cardiac surgeon. I saw it every day. But now, knowing what I knew, I needed to see her medical records. I called Margaret Whitfield, Catherine's sister, whose number I'd found in Preston's old contacts. We'd never met, and she was surprised to hear from me. Margaret, this is going to sound strange, but I need to know about Catherine's illness. What symptoms did she have before she died? There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Why are you asking me this? My voice cracked. Because I think your sister was murdered, and I think I'm supposed to be next. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Then Margaret's voice came back, hard and cold and certain. I've been waiting 5 years for someone to finally believe me. Her doctors said it was her heart, but she was healthy her entire life. Then suddenly she couldn't walk, couldn't see straight, couldn't hold a pen. They said it was cardiomyopathy, but I never believed it. Did she have tremors? I asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, and nausea. And her hair started falling out near the end. The doctors couldn't explain any of it. Sloan, what's happening to you? I looked at the coffee cup again, at the innocent-looking liquid that had probably contained another dose of poison. Everything Catherine experienced. He's doing it to me, too. That afternoon, I drove straight to the police station instead of going home. Detective Sarah Chen listened to my story with growing alarm, taking notes as I described the timeline of my symptoms, the toxicology results, Catherine's death, and Preston's behavior. Dr. Mercer, these are serious allegations, she said carefully. We'll need solid evidence to proceed. Right now, we have proof you've been poisoned, but we need to prove who's doing it and establish a pattern. Exhume Catherine's body, I said. Test her remains for thallium. If I'm right, you'll find the same poison in her system. That's your pattern. Detective Chen nodded slowly. That will require a court order and cooperation from her family. Are they willing to pursue this? I thought about Margaret's voice on the phone. 5 years of suspicion finally validated. Yes, they've been waiting for this chance. That night, I didn't go home. I checked into a hotel using cash and sat on the generic bed, staring at my still trembling hands. Preston called 17 times. He texted asking where I was, if I was okay, saying he was worried. Each message was perfectly crafted to sound like a concerned husband. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Dr. Rodriguez and began emergency chelation therapy to flush the thallium from my system before permanent damage set in. And I started planning how to prove that the man I'd married was a killer. The chelation therapy felt like fire moving through my veins. Dr. Rodriguez administered the treatment in a private room at Seattle Grace, away from prying eyes and questions from colleagues who might wonder why their head of cardiothoracic surgery was suddenly a patient. The medication bound to the heavy metals in my bloodstream, pulling the thallium out through my kidneys. But the process left me exhausted and aching. You're going to feel worse before you feel better, Elena warned as she monitored my vitals. But Sloan, every day we do this is another day you're healing instead of dying. I watched the IV drip and thought about how Preston must have calculated the doses so carefully. Enough to make me sick, to make me weak and dependent. But not enough to raise immediate red flags with my doctors. He'd been patient, methodical, probably planning to wait until my symptoms looked enough like natural illness that no one would question my death. The life insurance policy he'd taken out on me was for $2. $3 million. I'd found the paperwork hidden in his office safe when I went back to the house with Detective Chen to collect my belongings. He hadn't mentioned increasing the coverage from the original $500 in New Orleans. He'd just done it, forging my signature on the application. Margaret Whitfield became my unexpected ally in those early weeks. She drove up from Portland the day after our phone call, her face tight with 5 years of accumulated grief and rage. We met at a coffee shop near the hospital, and I saw immediately that she and Catherine had shared the same dark eyes and determined chin. I told everyone something was wrong, Margaret said, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. I told the police, the medical examiner, anyone who would listen. But Catherine was cremated before I could push for an autopsy, and without a body, there was no evidence. Preston made sure of that. He had her cremated? I asked, my stomach turning. Margaret nodded bitterly. Within 48 hours of her death. Said it was what Catherine wanted, but I never heard her say that. She always talked about wanting to be buried next to our parents. But Preston had power of attorney for medical decisions, and by the time I flew in from Portland, it was already done. I pulled out my phone and showed her the life insurance documents I'd photographed. He took out a policy on Catherine too, didn't he? $1, $8 million, collected every penny 6 months after her death. Then he sold their house, liquidated her retirement accounts, and moved to Seattle to start fresh. Margaret's voice shook with anger. I tried to sue him, tried to get the police to investigate, but everyone said I was a grieving sister who couldn't accept that my healthy 38-year-old sister just happened to drop dead. They made me feel crazy. You weren't crazy, I said quietly. You were right. The exhumation order took 3 weeks to process. During that time, I had to maintain the appearance of normalcy while secretly building a case against my husband. I moved back into our house, claiming the hotel stay had been about needing space to deal with my health issues. Preston welcomed me home with tears in his eyes and promises that we'd get through this together. I was so worried, he said, holding me close. When you disappeared like that, I thought something terrible had happened. Please don't shut me out, Sloan. Let me help you. The performance was masterful. If I hadn't known he was slowly killing me, I would have believed every word. Instead, I felt his arms around me and thought about how those same hands had measured out poison into my coffee for 7 months. I smiled and apologized for worrying him, and that night I poured the coffee he made me down the sink when he wasn't looking. Detective Chen had installed cameras in our kitchen, tiny devices hidden in the smoke detector and the clock on the wall. We needed to catch Preston in the act of adulterating my food or drinks. We needed video evidence that would hold up in court. But Preston was careful. Too careful. He never added anything to my coffee in view of the cameras. He must have been preparing it somewhere else. Maybe in his office upstairs or in the garage where we hadn't been able to install surveillance. After 2 weeks of watching footage that showed nothing incriminating, I was getting desperate. He knows something, I told Detective Chen during one of our secret meetings at the police station. He's being too cautious. Maybe he suspects I'm onto him. Chen frowned at her notes. Has his behavior changed at all? Any signs he's worried? I thought about it carefully. Preston had been solicitous and loving, but there was something else beneath the surface. A tension I hadn't noticed before. He keeps asking about my doctor appointments, wanting to know what tests they're running and what the results show. He offered to come with me to my next appointment with Dr. Rodriguez. That's good, Chen said. He's nervous. He's wondering why you're not getting worse. Keep him uncertain. Don't let him know you've stopped consuming anything he prepares. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Morrison approached me in the hospital cafeteria 3 weeks into my investigation. He sat down across from me with his lunch tray, his expression serious. Sloan, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react visibly because I think someone might be watching you. My heart started pounding, but I kept my face neutral, taking a bite of my salad. What is it? A man came to see me last week, said he was a lawyer representing your husband, asking questions about your health, your symptoms, your prognosis. He wanted to know if I thought your condition was terminal. I felt cold all over. What did you tell him? Morrison's jaw tightened. I told him I couldn't discuss a colleague's private health information and that he should leave. But Sloan, the questions he was asking, they weren't the questions of someone worried about his wife. They were the questions of someone planning for her death. What the hell is going on? I made a split-second decision. Morrison had been my mentor for 8 years. He'd stood beside me through countless surgeries, celebrated my successes, and caught my mistakes before they became disasters. If I couldn't trust him, I couldn't trust anyone. James, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, I said quietly, and then I need you to help me catch a murderer. By the time I finished explaining everything, Morrison's face had gone pale. Jesus Christ, Sloan. Catherine Whitfield was his first wife? The one who died of sudden cardiomyopathy? You remember her case? I asked, surprised. Morrison nodded grimly. I was consulting on her care in the ICU during her final admission. We couldn't figure out what was causing her cardiac dysfunction. Everything we tried failed. She coded 3 times before we finally lost her. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. Her husband was there the whole time, playing the devoted spouse. I remember thinking how tragic it was, how much he clearly loved her. God, I feel sick. I need you to pull Catherine's medical records from storage, I said. Every test, every scan, every blood panel. If we can show a pattern of symptoms identical to mine, it strengthens our case. Morrison was already pulling out his phone. I'll have them by tonight. And Sloan, I'm testifying at whatever trial comes from this. That son of a bitch used our hospital as cover for murder. That evening, Preston made dinner. Grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. He served it with white wine and candlelight, the picture of romantic domesticity. I've been thinking, he said as we ate. Maybe it's time you took a leave of absence from the hospital. Focus on your health. We could travel, spend time somewhere relaxing. What about that villa in Tuscany where we honeymooned? I forced myself to smile. That sounds wonderful. Let me just finish up my current patients and we can plan something. But what I was thinking was, he's escalating. He's trying to isolate me, get me away from the hospital and the doctors who might figure out what's happening. He's running out of patience. Actually, Preston continued, refilling my wine glass that I wouldn't drink. I already looked into flights. We could leave in 2 weeks. I found the perfect place, very secluded and private. Just us. 2 weeks. That's how long he thought I had before the poison did its work. I looked at my husband across our dining table and realized he'd probably already planned my funeral. Catherine's medical records arrived at midnight. Doctor. Morrison met me in my office at Seattle Grace, spreading the thick file across my desk with hands that shook slightly. We went through every page together, and with each test result, each symptom notation, each desperate attempt to save her life, the pattern became undeniable. Her initial complaints had started 8 months before her death. Tremors in her hands that made grading papers difficult. Nausea that her doctors attributed to stress. Fatigue so profound she'd taken a leave of absence from teaching. Vision problems that an ophthalmologist couldn't explain. Hair loss that dermatologists blamed on alopecia. Look at this, Morrison said, pointing to a blood panel from 6 weeks before Catherine died. Elevated liver enzymes, slightly abnormal kidney function. Exactly what we're seeing in your labs, except yours are improving now that you're in treatment. I stared at the numbers that told the story of a woman dying slowly, while everyone around her searched for natural explanations. They tested her for everything. Lupus, multiple sclerosis, thyroid disorders, even rare metabolic conditions. But no one thought to run a heavy metals panel. Why would they? Morrison asked quietly. She was a 38-year-old elementary school teacher with no known exposures. Thallium poisoning isn't something you see in clinical practice. Most doctors go their entire careers without encountering it. But I had encountered it now, in my own bloodstream, and in the ghost of Catherine's medical history. I photographed every page of her file, building a timeline that showed exactly how Preston had killed her and was trying to kill me using the identical method. The exhumation happened on a cold Tuesday morning in October. Margaret stood beside me at Evergreen Cemetery as workers carefully uncovered Catherine's grave. Detective Chen was there too, along with Dr. Philip Torres. the forensic pathologist who would be conducting the analysis. "The casket's been underground for 5 years," Dr. Torres explained as we watched. "Decomposition will be advanced, but hair and bone samples should still be viable for toxicology. Thallium deposits in keratin and bone tissue, so if it's there, we'll find it." I told Preston I had a medical conference in Portland that day. He'd kissed me goodbye that morning and reminded me to take my vitamins, the ones he'd been giving me every night. The ones Detective Chen had tested and found to be perfectly normal supplements. Whatever Preston was using to poison me, he was too smart to hide it in something obvious. We still hadn't caught him in the act, but the cameras were running continuously, and eventually he would make a mistake. Margaret gripped my hand as they lifted Catherine's casket from the ground. "She was afraid of him at the end," she whispered. "She told me something was wrong, that Preston had changed, that she didn't feel safe. But she was so sick, and I thought it was the illness making her paranoid. I should have listened." "You couldn't have known," I said, though I understood her guilt. I'd ignored my own instincts too. The small voice that had questioned Preston's perfection, the unease I'd felt when catching him going through my private papers. We silence those voices because we want to believe in love, in trust, in the goodness of the person who shares our bed. Dr. Torres worked carefully, collecting samples with the reverence due to the dead. "I'll expedite the analysis," he promised as he packed the evidence. "You should have preliminary results within 72 hours. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I went through the motions at the hospital, performing surgeries with hands that had finally stopped shaking, reviewing patient charts, teaching rounds to residents who had no idea their attending physician was waiting for proof that her husband was a serial killer. At home, I played the role of recovering wife, accepting Preston's care while dumping his coffee down drains and feeding his carefully prepared meals to the garbage disposal when he went upstairs to his office. "You look better," Preston observed one evening as we sat in the living room. There was something sharp in his tone that hadn't been there before. "Your color is improving. More energy. Whatever treatment Dr. Rodriguez has you on must be working." I looked up from the medical journal I was pretending to read and saw him watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "It's helping," I said carefully. "She thinks I might have been exposed to something environmental at the hospital. We're running more tests." Preston's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Environmental exposure. Interesting. What kind of substance?" "They're not sure yet. Some kind of heavy metal contamination, possibly in the water system or ventilation. They're testing other staff members, too." I watched his reaction carefully, and there it was, a flash of panic quickly masked. He hadn't expected me to get better. He hadn't prepared for the possibility that my doctors would identify the poison. His timeline was collapsing. That night, I woke at 3 a.m. to find Preston's side of the bed empty. I lay still, listening to the sounds of the house, and heard the faint clink of glass from downstairs. Moving silently, I crept to the top of the stairs and looked down into the kitchen. Preston was at the counter, illuminated by the refrigerator light, doing something I couldn't quite see. Then he turned, and I caught a glimpse of what he was holding, a small amber bottle with no label, the kind used for liquid medications. He measured out drops into a glass of orange juice using a medicine dropper, counted carefully, then stirred the liquid and placed the glass in the refrigerator. My morning juice. The one he'd bring to me in bed like he did every day, along with toast and fruit and declarations of love. I pulled back into the shadows of the hallway, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he'd hear it. But Preston simply rinsed the dropper, returned the amber bottle to somewhere I couldn't see, and headed back upstairs. I barely made it to our bedroom before him, diving under the covers and forcing my breathing to stay slow, and even as he slipped back into bed beside me. At 6 a.m, Preston brought me breakfast on a tray. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, kissing my forehead. "I made fresh orange juice, your favorite." I smiled and thanked him, waiting until he went to shower before I carefully transferred the juice to a plastic specimen bottle I'd hidden in my nightstand. This was it. This was the evidence we needed. Detective Chen had given me a dozen containers specifically for this purpose, telling me to preserve any food or drink that Preston prepared for me. I texted Chen immediately. Got it. Full glass of OJ. He added something from an unlabeled bottle at 3 a.m. Cameras should have caught it. Her response came within minutes. Don't consume anything. Bringing team to collect evidence now. Stay safe. The lab results came back 6 hours later. The orange juice contained enough thallium to cause serious harm if consumed daily. Combined with the video footage Chen's cameras had captured of Preston adulterating my juice in the pre-dawn darkness, we finally had proof of active poisoning. But we still needed Catherine's results to establish the pattern and prove premeditation. Dr. Torres called on Thursday afternoon. I was in my office at the hospital, reviewing surgical notes, when my phone rang. Dr. Mercer, I have the toxicology results from Catherine Whitfield's remains. My hand tightened on the phone. And? Thallium sulfate. Significant deposits in both hair and bone samples, consistent with chronic exposure over approximately 8 to 10 months before death. Dr. Mercer, the concentration levels are nearly identical to what we found in your initial blood work. He used the same poison, the same dosing pattern. This was absolutely murder. I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of vindication and horror. Catherine hadn't died of mysterious heart failure. She'd been murdered, slowly and deliberately, by the man who'd promised to love her. And I was supposed to be his second victim, following the exact same trajectory toward a grave he'd already picked out. When can you present this to the prosecutor? I asked. I'm writing my report now. With this evidence, combined with your case and the video footage, Detective Chen says they're ready to arrest Preston Whitfield. Dr. Mercer, you did it. You proved it. But I didn't feel victorious yet. I felt cold and calculated, like something in me had fundamentally shifted. The naive surgeon who'd fallen for a charming widower was gone, replaced by someone harder and more suspicious. Someone who understood that evil often wore the most appealing masks. I want to be there when you arrest him, I told Detective Chen when she called an hour later. I need to see his face when he realizes it's over. Chen hesitated. That's not standard protocol, Dr. Mercer. It could be dangerous. Preston might react unpredictably when confronted. I'm going to testify at his trial, I said firmly. I'm going to sit in a courtroom and face him with everything he did. Seeing him arrested is nothing compared to that. Please, I need this. There was a long pause. Then Chen sighed. Okay. But you stay in the car with an officer until we have him in custody. Understood? Understood. The arrest was scheduled for Friday evening. The arrest didn't go as planned. Detective Chen and her team arrived at our house at 7 p.m. on Friday, 3 patrol cars blocking the driveway. I sat in an unmarked vehicle 50 feet away, watching through the windshield as officers approached the front door. But Preston wasn't there. His car was gone, his phone going straight to voicemail. When Chen emerged from the house 20 minutes later, her face was grim. He ran, she said, leaning into my window. Closets emptied, passport missing, laptop gone. Dr. Mercer, when was the last time you saw him? My mind raced backward through the day. This morning, I left for the hospital at 5:30. He was still in bed. I told him I had surgery scheduled all day. Chen's radio crackled with updates. Units were checking the airport, train stations, border crossings. But I knew Preston had hours of head start. He'd probably left minutes after I did, taking only what he could carry quickly. He knew, I said, my voice hollow. Somehow he knew we were coming for him. Chen's expression darkened. Did you tell anyone about the arrest warrant? No one. I followed your instructions exactly. But even as I said it, doubt crept in. Had I been too careful around Preston? Had my improved health and changed behavior tipped him off that something was wrong? Or had he been monitoring my communications somehow, tracking my meetings with Chen and Margaret? That night, alone in the house that suddenly felt like a crime scene, I searched Preston's office thoroughly. Detective Chen's team had already been through it, but I knew the space intimately. I'd watched Preston work in here for 3 years, seen where he kept important documents, noticed his habits and patterns. The safe was empty, its door hanging open. His filing cabinets had been cleared out. But wedged behind his desk, I found a small notebook that had fallen into the gap between the furniture and the wall. My hands shook as I opened it. The pages were filled with Preston's neat handwriting, dates and dosages carefully logged. Catherine's name appeared throughout the first half. 8 months of entries detailing thallium administration, symptom progression, doctor appointments. The final entry was dated 2 days before her death. C barely conscious. Appears to be final stage. Life insurance claim can be filed in 6 months per policy terms. The second half of the notebook documented me. My name, our wedding date, the day he'd started poisoning me. 7 months of careful notes tracking my deterioration. But the entries stopped 3 weeks ago, right around when I'd started chelation therapy. The last note read, S health improving unexpectedly. Doctor appointments more frequent. Possible detection. Consider contingencies. I called Detective Chen immediately. She arrived within 20 minutes. Her team collecting the notebook as evidence. This is his insurance policy, Chen explained. Serial killers often keep trophies or records. They can't resist documenting their work. This proves premeditation for both murders. But he's gone, I said bitterly. What good is evidence if we can't find him? Chen's phone rang. She answered, listened, her expression shifting. When? Are you certain? She hung up and looked at me with something between concern and triumph. Preston tried to board a flight to Costa Rica 2 hours ago using a fake passport. TSA flagged him. He's in custody at SeaTac Airport. Relief flooded through me so intensely I had to sit down. You have him. We have him. And Dr. Mercer, he was carrying $470 dollars in cash, multiple fake IDs, and a burner phone with searches for non-extradition countries. He's not talking his way out of this. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. I spent those days preparing with the prosecutor, Daniel Martinez, a sharp-minded attorney who specialized in complex murder cases. We went over every detail of the evidence, the toxicology reports from both Catherine and me, the video footage of Preston adulterating my juice, the notebook documenting his crimes, the financial records showing life insurance policies, and motive. His defense is going to argue that the notebook is fiction, Martinez warned, that Preston kept it as research for a novel or some other innocent purpose. We need your testimony to tie everything together, to show the pattern of behavior. I thought about facing Preston in court, looking into the eyes of the man who'd held me while slowly killing me. I'm ready. Margaret flew up from Portland the day before the hearing. We met for dinner at a quiet restaurant, 2 women bound together by one man's evil. I dreamed about this for 5 years, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Getting justice for Catherine, proving I wasn't crazy. But now that it's happening, I feel terrified. Of what? I asked. Margaret twisted her napkin between her fingers. That he'll find some way to escape, that his lawyers will create reasonable doubt, that a jury will look at his handsome face and charming smile and decide we're both just bitter women making accusations. I reached across the table and gripped her hand. That notebook has both our sisters' deaths planned out in his handwriting. The video shows him poisoning me. Catherine's body has thallium in it. There's no talking his way out of that much evidence. But even as I said it, I felt the same fear Margaret did. Preston had fooled everyone for years. Doctors, police, friends, family. He was skilled at manipulation, at making people see exactly what he wanted them to see. What if he did it again? The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I stood at my bedroom window watching the Seattle skyline and thought about the moment I'd meet Preston's eyes in court. Would he still try to pretend he loved me? Would he show remorse or reveal the cold calculation that had always been underneath? I touched the spot on my arm where the IV had delivered chelation therapy, feeling the small bruise that remained. My body was healing. My hands were steady. But something inside me had changed permanently. I'd seen evil wearing the face of love, and I'd never be that trusting again. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Chen. Preston's lawyers are requesting bail. Judge is denying. He's staying locked up until trial. Sleep well, Dr. Mercer. Tomorrow, we make sure he never hurts anyone again. I looked at the message and felt something hard and certain settle in my chest. Tomorrow, the real battle began. The courthouse smelled like floor polish and anxiety. I arrived 30 minutes early, wearing the same navy suit I'd worn when I'd been promoted to head of cardiothoracic surgery. The suit that represented my competence, my authority, my refusal to be diminished by what Preston had tried to do to me. Detective Chen met me at the entrance, her hand briefly touching my shoulder in silent support. Margaret was already inside, sitting in the third row with her husband beside her. When our eyes met, she nodded once, and I saw 5 years of waiting for justice reflected in her expression. The courtroom filled quickly. I spotted several reporters in the gallery, their notebooks ready. Dr. Morrison sat near the back, his presence a quiet reassurance. Elena Rodriguez was there too, prepared to testify about my treatment and the thallium poisoning. The prosecutor, Daniel Martinez, was at his table reviewing notes, his paralegal organizing exhibits with practiced efficiency. Everything was ready. Everyone was in position. Now we just needed Preston. The side door opened and my breath caught. Preston entered in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him, a sheriff's deputy on each side. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his expensive suits and carefully styled appearance. His hair was uncombed, his face unshaven. But when his eyes found mine across the courtroom, I saw the same calculating intelligence that had fooled me for 3 years. He smiled at me. Actually smiled, like we were sharing some private joke, like this was all a misunderstanding that would be cleared up shortly. I didn't look away. I held his gaze and thought about the notebook documenting my planned death, about Catherine dying in an ICU while he played the devoted husband, about the orange juice he'd poisoned that very week. My hands rested calmly in my lap, steady and still, no longer trembling with the poison he'd fed me. That smile faltered slightly when he noticed. He'd expected to see me weak, sick, maybe even dead by now. Instead, I was here, healthy and whole, ready to destroy him. Judge Margaret Rosewood entered and we all stood. She was exactly as I'd heard. Stern, no nonsense, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything happening in her courtroom. She settled into her seat and looked directly at Preston, with an expression that suggested she'd already formed some opinions about what kind of man sat before her. Mr. Whitfield, you're charged with the first-degree murder of Catherine Ann Whitfield and the attempted murder of Dr. Sloan Mercer. How do you plead? Preston stood, and I watched him transform. His shoulders straightened. His expression shifted into something wounded and confused. When he spoke, his voice carried that same gentle reasonableness I'd fallen in love with. Not guilty, Your Honor. I'm devastated by these accusations. I loved both my wives. This is a horrible misunderstanding based on circumstantial evidence and grief-driven suspicion. The performance was masterful. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed him. Martinez stood to present the prosecution's case. He laid out the evidence methodically, the toxicology reports, the pattern of symptoms, the life insurance policies, the video footage. With each piece of evidence, he built an undeniable narrative of premeditated murder. But I kept my eyes on Preston, watching him react. He shook his head sadly at the toxicology reports, as if puzzled by how this could have happened. He looked pained when Martinez mentioned Catherine's death. He even wiped at his eyes when the prosecutor described my deteriorating health. Then it was time for Preston's attorney to speak. Richard Vance was everything I'd expected. Expensive suit, silver hair, the kind of polished confidence that came from winning cases that should have been losses. He stood and buttoned his jacket with deliberate precision. Your Honor, the prosecution's case relies heavily on coincidence and supposition. My client is a successful businessman who has suffered the tragedy of losing one wife to illness and now watches helplessly as his second wife, in her grief over her own health issues, has convinced herself that he's responsible for both situations. Vance painted a picture of me as an overworked surgeon whose stress-induced illness had triggered paranoia. He suggested Catherine's death was exactly what doctors had diagnosed: sudden cardiac failure from natural causes. He argued that the thallium in my system could have come from environmental exposure at the hospital, just as I'd told Preston. The exhumation of Catherine's body was characterized as a desperate attempt to validate my delusions. Dr. Mercer is a brilliant surgeon, Vance said smoothly, but she's not infallible. Her own health crisis has clouded her judgment. She's looking for someone to blame for her suffering, and unfortunately, she's targeting the man who loves her most. I felt rage building in my chest, hot and fierce. This was Preston's strategy: make me the unreliable narrator of my own poisoning, paint him as the victim of a sick woman's accusations. I looked at the jury box, still empty since this was just a preliminary hearing, and wondered if this approach would work when the trial came. Would 12 strangers look at Preston's handsome face and reasonable demeanor and decide I was simply mistaken? Martinez called his first witness, Dr. Philip Torres, the forensic pathologist who'd analyzed Catherine's remains. Torres took the stand and detailed his findings with scientific precision. The thallium levels in Catherine's hair and bone samples were consistent with chronic poisoning over 8 to 10 months. The concentration patterns matched the progression that would be expected from regular small doses administered with the intent to kill. In my professional opinion, Torres stated clearly, Catherine Whitfield was murdered through deliberate, sustained poisoning with thallium sulfate. Vance cross-examined aggressively, trying to create doubt about the reliability of testing remains that had been buried for 5 years. But Torres held firm, citing case studies and scientific literature supporting his methodology. When he stepped down, I saw Preston whisper urgently to his attorney, the mask slipping just slightly to reveal the panic underneath. Then Martinez called Detective Chen. She testified about the investigation, the video surveillance that had captured Preston adulterating my orange juice at 3 a.m. The footage was played in court, grainy but unmistakable. Preston at our kitchen counter, measuring drops from an unlabeled amber bottle into a glass of juice, stirring carefully, placing it in the refrigerator for me to drink when I woke. And what did laboratory analysis of that orange juice reveal? Martinez asked. Chen's voice was steady and damning. Thallium sulfate in sufficient concentration to cause serious harm with repeated consumption over time. The courtroom was completely silent. I watched Preston's face as the jury of public opinion, the reporters, the observers, Margaret, absorbed what they were seeing. His attorney was already preparing objections, arguing about chain of custody and warrant validity. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen him poison my juice with their own eyes. Martinez saved me for last. The prosecution calls Dr. Sloan Mercer to the stand. I stood and walked to the witness box, my legs steady beneath me. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then I sat down, looked directly at Preston, and prepared to tell the story of how the man I'd married had tried to kill me exactly the way he'd killed before. Martinez approached the witness stand with measured confidence. Dr. Mercer, please tell the court about the first time you experienced symptoms of illness after marrying Preston Whitfield. I took a breath and began. My voice was steady, clinical almost, as I described the tremors that had started 6 months into our marriage, the progressive weakness, the nausea, the vision problems. I explained how, as a cardiac surgeon, I'd initially attributed the symptoms to my demanding schedule, how I'd pushed through until I physically couldn't perform surgery anymore. "And what changed?" Martinez asked. "What made you realize something more serious was happening?" "Dr. Elena Rodriguez ran a comprehensive toxicology panel," I said, looking directly at the judge. "The results showed thallium poisoning. Thallium doesn't appear in the human body naturally. Someone had been administering it to me deliberately over a period of approximately 7 months. I watched Preston as I spoke. He sat perfectly still at the defense table, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table. Martinez walked me through the timeline of my illness, the chelation therapy, the investigation. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Dr. Mercer, when did you first suspect your husband might be responsible?" "When Detective Chen told me about Catherine Whitfield's symptoms before her death," I said. "They were identical to mine, and when I learned that Preston had insisted on cremation within 48 hours, preventing any possibility of thorough investigation, I knew." "Objection," Vance stood quickly. "Speculation and prejudicial statements about a death that occurred 5 years ago." Judge Rosewood looked at me over her glasses. "Dr. Mercer, please stick to facts you can substantiate." "Yes, Your Honor," I said calmly. Then I turned back to Martinez. "The facts are these. Catherine Whitfield died with the same symptoms I was experiencing. Her death benefited Preston financially through a life insurance policy of $1. $8 million. My death would have benefited him through a policy of $2.3 million that he took out without my knowledge. The exhumation of Catherine's body revealed thallium poisoning identical to mine, and video surveillance captured Preston adding thallium to my orange juice just days before his arrest." Martinez pulled out the notebook, the one I'd found behind Preston's desk. "Dr. Mercer, do you recognize this?" My hands wanted to shake looking at it, but I kept them steady. "Yes, that's Preston's handwriting. It's a detailed log of poisoning both Catherine and me. Dates, dosages, symptom progression, and financial calculations." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Rosewood banged her gavel sharply. "Order." Martinez opened the notebook to a marked page. "Can you read this entry dated 8 months ago, the week after your first anniversary?" I took the notebook, my eyes scanning Preston's neat handwriting. My voice didn't waver as I read aloud. "S continues to trust completely. Increased dosage to 0.3 milligrams. Tremors beginning as expected. Timeline suggests 8 to 10 months until terminal stage. Policy matures at full value in 6 more months. C's cremation ensured no comparison possible." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys. "He documented everything," I continued, flipping through pages I'd memorized. Catherine's poisoning, her symptoms, her death. Then he started over with me. Same method, same timeline, same outcome planned. Vance was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, that notebook's authenticity hasn't been established. It could have been planted, fabricated. Your client's fingerprints are the only ones on it." Martinez cut in smoothly. "And handwriting analysis confirms it's his writing. Would you like to see the expert reports?" Preston finally broke. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "Sloan, tell them the truth. Tell them you're doing this because you're sick and you need someone to blame. Tell them—" "Sit down, Mr. Whitfield," Judge Rosewood commanded sharply. But Preston was unraveling, the careful mask he'd worn cracking apart. "I took care of you," he said, his eyes locked on mine with something wild in them. "I made you coffee every morning, brought you vitamins every night. I was devoted to you. You were killing me," I said quietly, but my voice carried through the silent courtroom. "Just like you killed Catherine, slowly, methodically, while playing the concerned husband. You researched undetectable poisons. You calculated dosages. You planned my funeral while telling me you loved me. I did love you, Preston shouted. Both of you. Catherine was going to leave me. She'd found out about my debts, about the money I owed. She was going to divorce me, and I'd have lost everything. I didn't have a choice. The courtroom exploded. Vance was grabbing Preston's arm, trying to silence him, but Preston shook him off violently. And you, he pointed at me, his face contorted with rage. You, with your perfect career and your money and your success, you looked at me like I was your equal, but you always had the power. You always controlled everything. The only way to get what I deserved was to outlive you. Judge Rosewood was banging her gavel repeatedly. Bailiff, restrain the defendant. But Preston wasn't finished. He was screaming now, all pretense of innocence abandoned. I earned that money. I put up with Catherine's nagging and your endless work schedule. I played the supportive husband for years. The life insurance was mine. It was supposed to be mine. Deputies were moving toward him, but Martinez held up a hand, letting Preston's confession pour out unchecked. Every word was being recorded, every admission documented by the horrified court reporter. Do you know how hard it is to watch someone die that slowly? Preston was saying. Catherine took 8 months. I had to sit there every day, pretending to be devastated while she wasted away. It was exhausting. With you, I tried to be faster, more efficient. But you just wouldn't die. You kept fighting, kept getting stronger somehow. The bailiffs finally reached him, forcing him back into his chair. Preston struggled briefly, then seemed to deflate, the reality of what he'd just done settling over him. Vance looked like he might be sick, his defense strategy demolished by his own client's confession. Judge Rosewood waited until order was restored before speaking, her voice ice-cold. Mr. Whitfield, you've just confessed to the premeditated murder of Catherine Whitfield and the attempted murder of Dr. Sloan Mercer. Your admission has been recorded and will be entered into evidence. Bail is denied. You will remain in custody until trial, where I expect these proceedings will be considerably shorter, given what we've all just witnessed. She turned to me, her expression softening slightly. Dr. Mercer, you're excused from the stand. Thank you for your courage in bringing this to light. I stood on legs that suddenly felt weak, making my way back to the prosecution table. As I passed Preston, he grabbed my arm. His touch made my skin crawl, but I stopped and looked down at him. You were supposed to love me, he whispered desperately. We were supposed to be perfect together. I pulled my arm free, feeling nothing but cold certainty. You never loved anyone but yourself, and the only thing you earned is exactly what you're getting, justice for the women you tried to destroy. Martinez rested his hand briefly on my shoulder as I sat down. Margaret was crying in the third row, tears of relief streaming down her face. Catherine finally had her truth, and I had survived to tell it. Preston was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, no longer the charming widower who'd swept me off my feet, but a broken man who'd finally been caught. His confession had sealed his fate more completely than any evidence could have. Judge Rosewood set a trial date, though everyone knew it was a formality now. Preston Whitfield was going to prison for the rest of his life. As I walked out of the courthouse into the Seattle afternoon, I felt the weight of 7 months of poisoning, 3 years of lies, and a lifetime of broken trust finally lifting from my shoulders. 6 months after Preston's courtroom confession, I stood in my new office at Seattle Grace Medical Center, looking out over the city that had almost become the place where I died. The trial had lasted only 3 days. Preston's lawyers had attempted to argue temporary insanity, diminished capacity, anything to avoid the inevitable. But his recorded confession, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence, left the jury no choice. They deliberated for 97 minutes before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. First-degree murder of Catherine Whitfield, attempted first-degree murder of Dr. Sloan Mercer, multiple counts of fraud related to the life insurance policies. The judge sentenced him to life without possibility of parole, plus 30 additional years. Preston is currently serving his time at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. I've heard through Detective Chen that he spends most days in the prison library, reading medical journals and law books, still trying to find some angle that might set him free. He writes letters to me sometimes. Long, rambling things about how he really did love me, how the poisoning was a moment of weakness he regrets, how if I would just visit him we could work things out. I burn the letters without reading past the first few lines. Some voices don't deserve to be heard anymore. Margaret and I have become close friends, bonded by the trauma we shared and the justice we fought for together. She established a foundation in Catherine's name that provides resources for potential poisoning victims and trains medical professionals to recognize the signs of deliberate toxic exposure. I serve on the board and have given lectures at 3 major medical conferences about the importance of considering intentional poisoning in differential diagnoses when patients present with unexplained progressive symptoms. Catherine's death and my near death have probably saved lives by raising awareness that these things happen more often than anyone wants to believe. Dr. Morrison was promoted to chief of surgery when I stepped back to focus on research for 6 months during my recovery. He's offered me the position of co-chief now that I'm back at full capacity, but I've declined. The administrative work doesn't call to me the way surgery does. I'm back in the operating room 4 days a week, my hands steady and sure, holding human hearts and repairing the damage that disease and time inflict on the body. Every surgery reminds me that I survived, that my hands work because I fought back before the poison could cause permanent nerve damage. My health has returned almost completely. The chelation therapy worked, though Dr. Rodriguez says I'll need annual monitoring for the rest of my life to watch for any long-term effects of thallium exposure. My hair grew back thicker than before. The tremors never returned. Sometimes I still feel a ghost of nausea in the morning, a phantom echo of those poisoned months, but it passes quickly. The psychological scars took longer to heal than the physical ones. I saw a therapist twice a week for 4 months, working through the betrayal and the violation of having someone I trusted try to kill me slowly while I slept beside him. I moved out of the house I'd shared with Preston immediately after the trial. Couldn't stand another night in the bedroom where he'd brought me poisoned coffee, in the kitchen, where he'd measured out my death with a medicine dropper. I bought a modern condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and clean lines, a space with no memories attached. I changed my locks, my phone number, my daily routines. I installed a security system that would make Fort Knox jealous. For months, I couldn't drink anything I hadn't prepared myself or purchased sealed from a store. Couldn't eat food at restaurants without wondering if someone might tamper with it. Couldn't accept gifts without suspecting hidden motives. But slowly, carefully, I've learned to trust again. Not blindly, never blindly again, but with clear eyes and healthy boundaries. I date occasionally now, though I'm honest from the first conversation that I'm not looking for anything serious. The men I see are vetted thoroughly. Background checks, financial histories, references from ex-partners. It sounds paranoid, and maybe it is, but I've earned the right to my paranoia. I've learned that the price of ignoring red flags can be your life. Rachel, my best friend who sat through every day of the trial, tells me I'm different now. Harder, more guarded, less likely to give people the benefit of the doubt. She's right. The woman who fell in love with Preston's charm at a hospital fundraiser is gone, replaced by someone who understands that predators often wear the most attractive masks. But I don't think this change is entirely negative. I'm more protective of myself now, more aware of my own worth, less willing to diminish my accomplishments or apologize for my success. Preston tried to make me small enough to control, weak enough to kill. Instead, he made me stronger than I'd ever been. The hospital established new protocols after my case, requiring all staff members who show unexplained progressive symptoms to undergo comprehensive toxicology screening. It's called the Mercer Protocol informally, though officially it has some longer bureaucratic name. Dr. Rodriguez runs the program, and so far they've identified 2 cases of accidental heavy metal exposure from old pipes in the hospital's East Wing, and 1 case of intentional poisoning by a nurse's abusive boyfriend. That woman is alive today because someone recognized the pattern and tested her blood. Because Catherine died and I nearly died, and we fought back loud enough that people listened. I think about Preston sometimes, locked in his cell, probably still believing he was somehow justified in what he did. He took 2 talented, successful women and tried to erase us for money and ego. But Catherine's legacy lives on in the foundation that bears her name and the awareness her death created. And I'm still here, still operating, still teaching, still proving every day that I'm more than just a victim who survived. I'm a surgeon who looked at her own dying body, diagnosed the poison, and prescribed justice. The other day, a young resident asked me how I stayed so calm during complex surgeries, how I never seemed rattled by complications or unexpected bleeds. I thought about it for a moment before answering. I've faced worse than a difficult surgery, I told her. When you've survived someone actively trying to kill you, a challenging case doesn't seem quite so intimidating anymore. Some people might think that's a dark way to view the world, finding strength in trauma. But I've learned that survival isn't just about living through something horrible. It's about deciding what that experience makes you become. Preston wanted to reduce me to an obituary and an insurance payout. Instead, I became the woman who proved he was a murderer, who gave Catherine's family the closure they'd been seeking for 5 years, who changed medical protocols and saved other potential victims. If you're reading this or hearing this story and something about it resonates, if you have unexplained symptoms and someone in your life who seems too perfect, too attentive, too interested in your finances and your death benefits, please listen to your instincts. Get tested. Tell someone you trust. Don't ignore the small voice that says something is wrong just because you want to believe in love. Real love doesn't come with trembling hands and progressive weakness. Real love doesn't research undetectable poisons or forge signatures on insurance policies. And if you're the person who survived something like this, know that healing is possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. You'll be changed by it, carved into a different shape by the experience, but you get to decide if that shape is stronger or smaller. I chose stronger. Every day I choose stronger. Preston Whitfield thought he could live off my fortune by killing me quietly and collecting the insurance money. But the only thing he earned was a life sentence, and the knowledge that the women he tried to destroy are thriving while he rots in a cell. Catherine's memory is honored. Margaret has her justice. And I have my life, my career, my future. Everything he tried to steal. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply living well, living loudly, living in a way that proves the person who tried to silence you failed completely. I operate on hearts for a living, and mine is still beating strong, steady, and absolutely unstoppable. That's the sound of victory. That's the sound of survival. That's the sound of a woman who refused to die quietly and instead chose to live triumphantly. Preston wanted me dead. Instead, I'm more alive than ever. And that, in the end, is the sweetest justice of all.